got involved in campaigns on the role of tax havens and siphoning money out of poorer countries. And it's kind of been amazing to see all these things that seem so big and intractable. Actually, if you have the right ideas, the right networks, and your timing's good, you can have a huge impact on these things.
You're an author, campaigner, scholar, global policy executive. What drives your passion for ending poverty, preventable diseases, hunger? Where does that all come from?
Well, I think the first thing is
Great to have you on the podcast, David.
thanks for inviting me. It's great to be with you and see you again.
You're an extremely busy man. You're an author, campaigner, scholar, global policy executive. What drives your passion for ending poverty, preventable diseases, hunger? Where does that all come from?
I grew up in Belfast in the 1980s, which wasn't really a fun place to be. It was kind of very insular. There was obviously the kind of conflict. There was this kind of sense of this kind of overbearing sense of fear, lots of religious conservatism. And then whenever I was 16, the Good Friday Agreement was signed, and it felt it was kind of like living through a miracle. And then straight after that, I went on a trip to India, and that kind of blew my mind, kind of just seeing the kind of diversity of humanity, but also seeing the extreme inequalities there just kind of had a profound effect on me. And I kind of decided at that moment, I want to find out why these inequalities exist and do something about them. So I came back, I got involved in the Jubilee Debt campaign, I got involved in campaigns on the role of tax havens and siphoning money out of poorer countries. And it's kind of been amazing to see all these things that seem so big and intractable. Actually, if you have the right ideas, the right networks, and your timing's good, you can have a huge impact on these things. Coming out of Northern Ireland and seeing how things can change made me want more of that, on a kind of like international stage, I suppose.
You work for One, and it's One's 20th birthday year,
Yeah.
which is pretty amazing. So congrats on that. For anyone who doesn't know what is One, tell us a little bit about where did it come from? What is it?
It's a movement that's fighting for economic opportunities and healthy lives by building political power and convincing governments to make really big bets. So it came out of the Jubilee Debt campaign, that resulted in $110 billion of illegitimate debts being cancelled. And when that campaign wrapped up, the AIDS crisis was kind of raging, particularly in Africa. And the co-founders of One, Bono, Bobby Shriver, Jamie Drummond, Lucy Matthew, they decided actually, A, we need to do something about this, and B, we need an organization to like drive these things forward. And that led to a campaign that eventually convinced George W. Bush to back the fight against HIV and AIDS, which saved 26 million lives through providing access to antiretrovirals. And a lot of those things are kind of like under threat right now, but it just shows the power of bringing people together, convincing powerful leaders that actually you can do the right thing, and the impact that that can have.
And some massive achievements. What excites you the most about One's campaign work at the moment?
Well, I feel like I'm kind of holding two conflicting feelings in my head all the time. One is like existential dread, like World War III is coming, like it's kind of, the world just seems to be kind of fragmenting and falling apart. And the other is like a sense of excitement because clearly the world hasn't been working for a lot of people. And it's in moments of disruption that actually you can kind of make big changes happening. So, I mean, I'm quite excited about the fact that I think a lot of countries in the global south have a newfound self confidence. And that's, I think, come from the fact that there is now this geopolitical competition and they've realized that they've got leverage. They can play these kind of big powers off against one another. They can push for reforms. We've seen that, with reforms to the IMF and the World Bank. I think there's an opportunity now to say, actually, we need much more country ownership. So there's a lot of, kind of hand wringing about the cuts to USAID and other funders cutting money. And I think that's, it's a really bad thing. The way it has been done has been kind of the kind of glee with which it has been done is kind of like horrific, and the impacts that are going to fall from that are horrific. But at the same time, ultimately, we do want countries to be able to stand their own 2 feet, to fund their own development programs. And I think this will kind of forge some or force some conversations about how do we reduce the cost of sovereign borrowing? How do we make sure that countries are actually being accountable to their citizens and allocating money in the right ways? There's a lot of money being spent on defense and kind of being wasted that could be invested in health and education and agriculture. And there is a demographic shift, particularly in Africa, where young people are demanding change in the way that wasn't happening 10, 20 years ago.
Mm.
So it's kind of scary but exciting.
Let's talk a little bit about that. I mean, 2025 has seen, crazy cuts to aid in many countries around the world. What impact do you think this is really having on the efforts to eradicate poverty and hunger? What are you seeing at the moment and hearing?
The first thing is, a lot of low and middle income countries are heavily dependent, particularly in the health space. So, there's been a lot of analysis on, countries like Sierra Leone, Chad, where a huge proportion of their health budgets are actually covered by the US government. And of course, that was never a sustainable situation. It was a response to an emergency, which was the AIDS crisis. But a lot of those programs are being shut down. A lot of democracy programs, human rights programs, gender. So I think in the short term, there will be a real rollback of the kind of project level of work that's really impactful. And what we're seeing in some countries is that they are kind of stepping in. We saw that in Ghana, Nigeria, South Africa to say, okay, this funding's been cut. We're going to allocate money to this from our domestic budget. The problem is, I think that a lot of countries just don't have that space because they've been, since COVID, COVID was a kind of major hit on their fiscal reserves. You had tourism, remittances, all the kind of economic effects of COVID. Then Russia invaded Ukraine, that caused an inflation crisis. The Federal Reserve increased interest rates, which most of international debt is denominated in dollars. So the cost of servicing that debt went up. And it seems like all these international events, which these countries had nothing to do with causing, are really having a major impact. So what I think we as activists need to do now is to kind of figure out, okay, the old playbook of convincing countries in, like rich countries to invest in aid might be diminishing. Even with all these cuts, aid's still going to be like $100 billion a year. But we also need to look at, how do we change the rules? Like, why is debt so expensive for low and middle income countries? Why do they not have enough of a say in the IMF and World Bank? You know, why are they not able to trade on fair terms and invest in their own industries? How can they get, more value addition from their critical minerals? And I think that's the way the conversation is going to go, and that's really a good thing because ultimately we want economic transformation. That's what's going to result in poverty. The countries that have really reduced poverty, and the best examples of that, South Korea, Vietnam, it's been through effectively industrialization and job creation, not through development programs. So I think that conversation about economic transformation is what really needs to happen, and it's being forced now in a way we wouldn't have wanted, but it's happening.
Amongst this debate that is happening around, so you're seeing that there's kind of these calls for, there's these forced reforms, I guess, that are having to happen and thinking, but then there's also this need for this acceleration. What are you thinking are some of the best ideas on the table about how we get back on track? Like, what are you hearing as the kind of some of the best ways and for us to kind of start moving forward and moving our development agenda?
Well, I think it needs to happen at a whole range of different levels.
Yeah.
So there's the kind of international macroeconomic, there's the national, there's the individual and community level. So on the community level, I think, you know, a big part of what we need to start realizing is that innovation is happening at the local level. There's that saying of like, necessity is the mother of invention. And I think what a lot of people are missing in this debate about cuts is that, with the climate crisis hitting, with, things changing, like local communities are finding solutions. Those are solutions to their own problems, but they could be solutions to problems internationally. And this whole idea of like rich country transfers resources and knowledge to poor country, I think needs to change completely, because some of the best solutions are being found by those on the front line. So, this whole idea of like circular cooperation, everyone should be kind of like contributing, everyone should be learning from one another, everyone should have a say in what's happening, I think is a really exciting idea. And that applies at the kind of programmatic kind of community level. Then at the national level, I think, the key thing is that governments are more accountable and more transparent to their citizens. And we've seen, in the past, you know, lack of efficiencies, money going missing, lack of transparency, a real kind of lack of confidence in governments to deliver. And that's why I think a lot of entrepreneurs and kind of young people are kind of, they look up to business leaders rather than to government leaders. And so I think, pushing for more transparency at the national level, and the idea that we have country level plans that are about economic transformation is something that is a kind of big part of the debate now. And then at the international level, we need to look at the barriers to that economic transformation. And a big one, that we're working on at one, is the cost of debt. So if you look
Mm.
at, an African country, for example, they'll go to the international bond market and pay like 9, 10, 11, 12%, because they are considered more risky than Germany, that'll pay like 2, 3%. But actually, if you look at the fundamentals, a lot of that kind of risk rating is as a result of lack of enough data. These international credit rating agencies that don't maybe have understanding of the nuance of the country, that there are actually kind of reforms, regulatory reforms that could be put in place that will kind of bring that cost down. And what we're seeing, I mean, you saw this in Kenya a couple of years ago, where they had to avoid paying civil servants in order to get an international bond payment. What, like, that sounds kind of quite like technocratic language. What it meant was that teachers and health workers weren't getting paid so that Wall Street bankers could get paid. And to me, that's like a very unjust situation. So we need to find ways of like rebalancing that and kind of finding ways of like bringing those costs down, because it means that there'll be more money for agriculture, for health, for education in those budgets. The only entities that are going to pay for that are like BlackRock and PIMCO and these international investors that are currently raking it in. But it's not something that international donors are going to have to pay for, or it's a technical problem that could be solved, unlocking
Yeah.
like tens of billions every year. And I think those kinds of reforms that are now on the table are quite exciting.
I don't think people fully understand this. So, when you talk about these kinds of loans and these kinds of bonds and things like that, are you saying African countries are getting a kind of unfair deal on the whole in terms of this? And so they're paying at a higher rate. And so this needs to be structured, or is it legislated? Like how does it kind of work for people that don't fully understand this?
If you're in an African country and you can borrow from other countries like the US,
Yeah.
France, Germany.
Yeah.
You can borrow from the World Bank and the IMF, and they tend to give like lower rates. Or you can go to international bond markets. And what happened, after the kind of the financial crisis, was that interest rates, hit historic lows, like sometimes even negative. If you were a country that had like a growing population, infrastructure needs, you were effectively saying, like, we'll go to the market, we'll get kind of like really cheap money. And that made sense. But then after COVID, after Russia invaded Ukraine, all that dynamic changed. The era of cheap money is no longer with us, and these costs are really high. So a lot of
Mm.
the kind of conversation now is, whenever these credit rating agencies, for Standard and Poor, they're kind of private entities, they will go into a country, they'll make an assessment, and they'll give a country a rating which will determine how much it pays for its loans. But often those assessments are based on like patchy data. So if there isn't enough data in place, they'll kind of either make a subjective assessment, or they'll create synthetic data sets from another country that don't necessarily reflect the actual risk that international investors are facing. So if we were to fix that, get more regular data, have a better dialogue so that these credit rating agencies understood what was actually happening in the country, you could bring those costs down, and then you'd have more money to invest in healthcare and education and so on.
So I guess they're looking at risk as well. So it would help reduce the risk for them, which then
Yeah.
means they can be more competitive. So you're talking about data. So what is the challenge with data? Like, obviously, we work a lot on food systems and hunger. Is there a lot of data missing in that space in certain countries? Like, what's going to be required to get this shifted?
There's a kind of like lack of data availability, but there's also a lack of data coordination. And so what we're finding is that a lot of data sets are kind of sitting here, there, and everywhere, and that means that the transaction costs in accessing them are really high. So if you want to find out, information on like health programming from international donors, you're going to have like loads of different donors doing their own thing. You're going to have the government making its own investments. Sometimes there are incentives for those actors to actually not have coordination so that they can have their own thing that's kind of like invisible to others. So it's kind of like, in some senses, off the books and they can do what they want with it. But that means in a lot of countries, if you're the health ministry, actually don't know what's happening, like who's investing in health in your country. And the same applies across, agriculture, across lots of different sectors. So part of what we're doing, and we've got a project with Google actually, it's kind of trying to do for the world's public data what Google Maps did for spatial data. And if you think about the world before Google Maps, had to get a physical map. Now that's all like instant. So, and if you kind of fast forward to now, like if you're trying to find out all that information, you might have to like download like 15 different reports, like read through them all, get to like page 356 where there's like one data set, you copy it. Like it just takes a lot of energy. And if we could just bring that all together so that, and incorporate AI so you can just ask, okay, well, you know, what's the health budget in Uganda? Who's spending what in this region? Like literally type that into your computer and you get the latest data. Then that could, I mean, that's the technology is available now. We just need to do the work of like collating all this information, and that's what we're working on with Google.
I know data is so important, but the fact that that results in more expensive money, which means countries are borrowing, which means countries can't provide basic infrastructure in many parts of the world. That kind of connection, that line gets broken in most people's thoughts through news bites and sound bites. I mean, this is the problem that now with AI and with all the tools we have could be organized in such a way to actually make that really. I think this is great. We know that the financial systems are needing this kind of transformation. Coming up later this month, there's the fourth Financing for Development Summit in Seville. What do you think can be achieved at this summit, and what do you think it can inspire in terms of reforms that can challenge some of this inequality?
Again, I have like two conflicting thoughts in my head. One is that this is like a very slow moving, like lowest common denominator UN negotiating process that probably isn't going to lead to a huge amount. The fact that the event is happening will kind of force some conversations that could lead to like big reforms. And I think a big part of that is, as I kind of said earlier, like countries in the global south, like asserting themselves, saying we demand change. And this is a forum for them to do that. Because it's the UN, you have to like address everything, try and solve every problem. You end up with these like documents that are like 70 pages long that include every issue. And I think part of what we need to do is to say, like, let's really kind of boil down to the priorities and use multilateral systems to set clear goals, but then devolve action to like the most local level possible. And I think if we were to kind of use the fact that these institutions are being disrupted by, and the political systems are being disrupted by geopolitics, to say actually there's a different way of doing this. Let's agree on like what's really important and what we want to aim for, but then empower local actors with the finance and the access to knowledge and the communities
Yeah,
to learn from one another,
yeah,
to
yeah.
do this differently.
In terms of meeting some of the gaps, what other like finance sort of types could be leveraged to sort of fill some of the gaps that we're seeing at the moment? Is there anything that you're seeing? Obviously you've mentioned debt. What else is there?
There's this phrase kind of that's emerging, um, you know, shifting from financing for development to financing from development. How do you then rechannel that back and kind of, stimulating more action? And so, earlier this month, there was an event in Marrakesh, the Mo Ibrahim Forum, and that whole kind of event was focused on African resources, finance,
Mm,
assets, pension funds, and which are currently invested in international funds. How do you kind of bring those back and invest those, in African countries? How do you maximize tax revenues. How do you look at remittance flows, which are massive but are often subject to like very high costs? In some respects, that's kind of going in the wrong direction when you look at the US. But if you look at China, like it's the opposite.
Mm.
China announced last week that they are, removing all tariffs for African countries. So it's really fascinating how what seems to be a really negative picture is kind of stimulating action in other places, which could
Mm.
create a lot of opportunity and growth.
Do you see going forward, like, is that where you see hope in this as well? You talked about those two counter thoughts, but do you see that hope through new actors coming in and just these different ways?
Yeah, although I mean, where the hope comes is in people themselves taking control of their own lives and opportunities, and demanding more of others. So I think there is a risk for folks working in this kind of international space to say, well, now that the US is retreating, China will step in or UAE will step
Yeah,
in.
yeah, yeah,
Some of that is true, but actually, it will be the domestic reforms, the businesses
yeah.
that are attracting investment. Like that's what's actually going to drive the change. There's a economist that I really like, Stefan Durkon, who talks a lot about the fact that there is an assumption that like international funders and actors can come in and like have influence. That can be true at the kind of micro level, but if you're looking at kind of transformation of a country, it only happens when you've got political will, a kind of an elite or a government that are like they have the interest to reform. So that's where citizen action comes in, and often that's seen as a kind of like a kind of an afterthought or like the third bullet point on the list. I think it should be number one.
I think I've been having a lot of conversations lately around the power dynamic and where the power is, and are we just shifting from one power dynamic to another power dynamic? But I think what you're saying and what I'm hearing is this is about an empowerment dynamic, which is about the power needs to be held by the people who are ultimately looking to work out their future, and that power needs to be then put to localized governments to deliver that.
I think it's also partly about helping people realizing how much power they have. I mean, going back to the Jubilee campaign, that was people coming together like who probably didn't have a huge amount of knowledge or influence over like international debt issues, but they forced like
Yeah.
the biggest shift of the era because they came together and spoke with one voice.
And there were a lot of, pockets of people that came together from different, faith leaders, community groups that came and they found a voice on an issue that in many ways they probably didn't fully understand, but they understood the justice element of it, or they understood the human element of those stories and the impacts, and they were able to make an impact by uniting together.
I think there's a real. I mean, I see this all the time. Like, there's this almost like withholding of power through technical language. You don't really understand this stuff because you don't have the language to like participate in these discussions. When actually, the fundamental issues often are kind of quite clear. They are rooted in injustice, in power dynamics. You need kind of technical experts to be able to kind of navigate those kind of big issues. But often it's a translation to say, okay, well, this complex issue is really about these three things. Here's the decision maker that can change it. Here's when they're making the decision. Therefore, you need to do X.
This has been super helpful, David, and I think you do explain some of these technical areas in ways that can help make sense to people. And I think it's really important for all of us to understand a little bit more about why some of these injustices have happened and what's holding them back. And I really appreciate that. And, even yeah, my brain's running now on a whole range of different issues, which is great. And I know it can be technical stuff, but it doesn't have to be complicated stuff. It's often simple issues of justice, but then we just have to kind of find the end of the string and pull a little bit.
Yeah, totally. And I think there's also something about like learning from people who are like in different worlds. Like I often try and think about how do I connect the dots with people working in the
Mm.
art world, in music.
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
there's always stuff that we can learn from one another, rather than
yeah,
kind of
yeah.
experts kind of like holding on to their position because they've got like the knowledge that other people don't have. I'd love to continue the conversation, and yeah, if anyone wants to get in touch on LinkedIn or whatever, then like let's talk.
If you don't follow David on LinkedIn, you need to, because he always summarizes these big issues of news of the day in ways that people can actually engage with and contemplate. So definitely worth having a look. One thing that I like to always finish these conversations with is obviously we do a lot around food and we think about the memories of food. And I think food is another area like art, like, the arts, all of these kinds of areas where it's deeply personal. We're all experts in what we like and what we don't like, what our food memories are. And that I think is part of the beauty of this world. What's a food memory that shaped you? Is there good, bad, or otherwise? What's something that shaped your story?
And just, I hadn't thought about this beforehand, but I mean, I suppose like growing up in Belfast in the 80s, it was like kind of pretty, it was like potatoes all the time, it was like a kind of cliche.
Yeah,
And I remember like the first time I went with like my school friends to a restaurant, we went to an Indian restaurant. It kind of like all the kind of flavors and everything, it kind of blew my mind. So that's what comes to mind right now.
those experiences, depending where you grow up, what time, or your family, all these things, they shift. And I remember I lived in Rome for a little while, and we used to visit a pizza restaurant that you've probably been to. It's Estaccio, but the
Mm.
owner would often come out and choose what pizza you were having. And he would kind of he'd blow a whistle. They were always fighting and it was like theater, and it was this
Yeah, yeah,
amazing kind of experience. But great pizza, very uncomplicated, local ingredients, very Roman style. But I used to just love this. Like, you just go there. Every time I go to Rome now, I always go there and eat there. And if people say, "Where's the best pizza?" It's usually there. It's probably not the best pizza, but
yeah, yeah.
it's the best pizza
Experience.
experience. And those
Yeah.
kinds of things are great. So, well, thank you. Really appreciate you joining us, and really want to encourage you in the work that you guys are doing, and tell people who are listening to check out the work that you're doing and that one's doing, and really learn, ask questions, and see how you can get involved.
Thanks, Paul. And likewise, I think the work you're doing is great. Not just the like mobilization work, but also like how you're trying to like encourage people to communicate these issues in different ways. And you know this the stuff you're doing with chefs and everything is really, really fantastic. So keep it up and let me know how I can help.
Thank you.